The silence of Eli Morgan's land was a living thing. It pressed in from the barren ridges that scraped against a low, gray sky and rose from the snow-dusted floor of the valley. It was a silence broken only by the sharp crack of his axe, splitting pine, or the mournful complaint of wind weaving through the skeletal arms of the aspens. His small, weather-worn ranch was a speck of human endeavor in a vast, indifferent wilderness, a place a man came to be forgotten, and for 5 years, Eli had courted that oblivion. The cabin was sturdy, built with his own hands. The logs chinked tight against the coming bite of a Wyoming winter. A thin plume of smoke, the only sign of life for miles, rose from the stone chimney and was immediately torn to shreds by the wind. Inside, the sparse furnishing spoke of a life pared down to its essentials: a cot, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, a stone hearth, and a shelf of tins and jars. There had once been 2 chairs, but one now sat in the corner, holding a stack of mended saddle blankets, its presence a constant, dull ache in the room. The winter of 1873 was closing in fast, with a mean look in the clouds that promised a long, hard freeze. Eli moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who knew the rhythms of the seasons as well as he knew his own heartbeat. He spent his days securing the homestead for the months of isolation, his movements a ritual against grief. He stacked firewood until the pile reached the eaves of the cabin, repaired a loose board on the barn door, and checked the stores of salted meat and flour in the root cellar. Each task was a familiar comfort, a way to fill the hours that stretched, empty and silent, before him. It was in the quiet moments that she came to him, not as a ghost, but as a memory so sharp it could draw blood. Sarah. He would be mending a fence line, his fingers numb with cold, and he would suddenly feel the phantom warmth of her hand on his arm. He would see her in the slant of the afternoon sun that lit up the dust motes dancing in the barn, her laughter echoing in the hollow chambers of his heart. 5 years. 5 years since he had held her, her body racked with a pain he was helpless to soothe. 5 years since the midwife had emerged from their bedroom, her face a mask of grim finality, to tell him that both Sarah and the tiny, unnamed son she had borne were gone. The silence they left behind was a weight he carried every day. He had buried them on the small rise overlooking the creek, beneath a lone pine tree, and a part of him had been buried there with them. He had learned to live with the hollowness inside him, to pack it down like snow underfoot, hard and cold and unyielding. The world had kept turning, but Eli Morgan had not. He needed supplies before the first heavy snow made the trail into town impassable. He hitched his steady gelding, blew, to the buckboard and set off, the ironclad wheels groaning in protest against the frozen ruts of the path. The town of Redemption was a day's ride away, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled along a muddy main street. It was a place he visited only when necessity demanded, a place of noise and people and judgment that grated on his settled solitude. As he neared the edge of town, he could see something was wrong. A small crowd had gathered near the livery stable, their bodies forming a tight knot of morbid curiosity. At its center was a stagecoach, tilted at a drunken angle, one of its rear wheels shattered. The spokes splayed out like broken teeth. The driver was cursing a blue streak, gesturing wildly at the splintered wood, while the other passengers were being helped down, their faces a mixture of relief and irritation. But it was not the broken coach that held Eli's attention. Standing apart from the others, as if enclosed in her own invisible circle of misery, was a young woman. She was dressed in a wedding gown, or rather, what was left of one. The fine white fabric was splattered with mud and grease, the hem torn and ragged. A delicate veil was ripped, hanging lopsided from her hair, which had come undone from its neat pins and now fell in disheveled waves around her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her face pale and devoid of expression. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were wide and staring, fixed on some distant point beyond the gawking faces of the townspeople, as if she were watching her entire world burn down and could do nothing but bear witness to the flames. She was alone, utterly and devastatingly alone, and the humiliation radiating from her was so palpable it was like a physical blow. Eli tied Blue to the hitching post in front of the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk, his boots thudding softly on the weathered planks. The usual buzz of town life was muted, replaced by a low murmur of gossip that spread through the crowd like a contagion. He caught snippets of it as he passed. "The Finch boy's bride," a woman whispered to her neighbor, her hand covering her mouth in a gesture of feigned propriety. "Sent her packing before she even got to the church," another voice added, laced with a cruel sort of glee. Old man Finch himself rode out to meet the stage and called the whole thing off. Eli entered the mercantile, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt jarringly out of place. The store was owned by the Finches, the wealthiest family in Redemption. Augustus Finch was a man who measured the world in dollars and cents, and his wife, Martha, measured it in degrees of social standing. Their son, Jedediah, was a soft, doughy young man who had never made a decision for himself in his life. Eli gathered the things he needed: a sack of flour, a block of salt, coffee, and a box of cartridges, his movements slow and methodical as he listened to the talk that now filled the store. "It's that scandal from her hometown," Martha Finch was saying in a loud, self-important voice to the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable. She was a large woman, corseted so tightly she looked as if she might burst. Augustus sent a man to inquire. You see, a precaution, and the things he learned, well, it simply would not do. Not for our Jedediah. Mrs. Gable, a small, bird-like woman with eyes that missed nothing, leaned in closer. "What was it, precisely?" Martha Finch lowered her voice to a conspiratorial hiss, though it was still loud enough for Eli to hear every word. "There was a man, a soldier. He claimed he saw her once without her corset on." A collective gasp went through the small circle of women who had gathered around the counter. In their world, such a claim, whether true or not, was a death sentence to a woman's reputation. It spoke of a looseness, a lack of moral fiber that was simply unforgivable. To be seen in a state of undress, even if only rumored, was to be branded as ruined goods. "She denies it, of course," Martha continued, waving a dismissive hand. "But where there's smoke, there's fire. I always say, we couldn't have the Finch name sullied by such a person. We gave the driver money to take her back where she came from. It is a shame the coach broke down here. Now the whole town has to be burdened with the spectacle." Eli paid for his goods, his face impassive. He loaded the supplies onto the buckboard, his mind turning over the quiet cruelty of it all. He had seen hangings that were more merciful. This was a slow execution, carried out by whispers and sideways glances. As he prepared to leave, he saw her again, the bride, Cora Whitley. He'd heard someone call her. She was no longer standing by the coach. She was sitting on a bench outside the closed-down assay office, her small traveling trunk beside her. The crowd had mostly dispersed, having extracted all the drama they could from her plight, and now she was just a piece of unfortunate debris left behind by the day's events. He watched her for a long moment. She had tried to fix her hair, but her hands were trembling too much to manage the pins. Her shoulders were slumped in exhaustion and defeat. She had nowhere to go. The Finches had made it clear she was not welcome. The town, following their lead, had already shunned her. The innkeeper would likely refuse her a room, fearing the wrath of the Finches. And even if he did not, it was clear she had no money. Her family, wherever they were, had cast her out once before over this same rumor. They would not welcome her back now, shamed and penniless. He found himself walking toward her, not entirely sure what he was going to say. His own life was a monument to keeping the world at arm's length. He had no room for other people's troubles. His own were a heavy enough load, yet he could not simply ride away and leave her there to freeze when night fell. He had seen too much of the world's casual brutality to add to it through his own inaction. He stopped a few feet in front of her. She did not look up at first, and then, sensing his presence, she slowly raised her head. Her eyes were a startling shade of blue, now clouded with a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "Miss Whitley," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched at the name, the sound of it now a brand of her shame. She said nothing, only watched him, her expression wary. "The snow will be heavy by morning," he stated. "A simple fact. You cannot stay here." A single, bitter tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "I have nowhere else to be." Her voice was quiet, a mere whisper of sound, but it was steady. There was a core of strength in her that had not yet been broken. Eli considered his next words carefully. He was not offering charity, and he was certainly not offering comfort. He was offering a practical solution to a practical problem. "I have a ranch, a day's ride from here. There is a barn. It's dry and out of the wind. You can stay there a few nights, until you figure out what you are going to do." She stared at him, her blue eyes searching his face for his angle, for the price that would be demanded of her. She found nothing but a kind of weary resignation. He was a man who looked as weathered and solitary as the land he came from. "Why?" she asked, the word barely audible. Eli looked away, toward the distant mountains that were already disappearing behind a curtain of gray cloud. "No one should have to freeze to death on a public bench." He looked back at her. "It is just a barn, but it is warmer than this." Cora Whitley looked at the man before her, then at the hostile faces that peered at her from behind curtained windows. She looked at her ruined dress and her worthless trunk. She had no money, no family, and no future. All she had was this moment, and the offer from a stranger with sad eyes. It was not a choice between good and bad, but between the unknown and certain ruin. She gave a single, jerky nod. All right. The journey to the ranch was made in near total silence. Eli helped her onto the buckboard, placing her small trunk in the back, and they rode out of town without a backward glance. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying with it the first hard flurries of snow. He gave her a thick wool blanket from under the seat, and she wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, huddling into its warmth. They did not speak, but they observed. Cora noticed the way he handled the horse, his hands gentle but firm on the reins, his low voice soothing when Blue spooked at a rabbit darting across the trail. She saw the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes and mouth, the way his gaze constantly scanned the horizon, as if he were watching for a threat that only he could see. He was a man wrapped in a profound loneliness, a fortress of a man with walls built high and thick. Yet he had shown her a kindness, however gruff and impersonal, that no one else had. She watched the landscape unfold around them, vast, wild, and unforgiving. It was beautiful in its starkness, but it was a lonely kind of beauty. It suited the man who was driving her into its heart. Eli noticed the way she sat, her back straight and her chin held high, a small, desperate act of defiance against the crushing weight of her circumstances. He saw the tremor in her hands as she clutched the blanket, a betrayal of the calm she projected. Her eyes, he noticed, were not just full of sadness. They were intelligent, observant. She was taking everything in, assessing the land, the trail, the man beside her. She was not a wilting flower. She was a woman who had been dealt a terrible hand and was still trying to figure out how to play it. He felt a flicker of something that might have been respect. It was an unfamiliar feeling, and it made him uneasy. As dusk settled, bleeding purple and gray across the snow-covered plains, the small homestead came into view. It looked like the loneliest place on earth. He drove the buckboard into the barn and unhitched Blue. The barn was large and clean, the air thick with the warm, earthy smells of hay and animal life. A milk cow and 2 other horses watched them from their stalls with placid curiosity. "The loft is up there," Eli said, pointing with his chin toward a sturdy ladder. "There's plenty of clean hay. It's warm enough." He took the blanket from the buckboard and handed it to her, along with a small bundle he had retrieved from his saddlebag. It contained a piece of jerky and a hard biscuit. "It's not much, but it's something." "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. He merely nodded, his face shadowed in the dim light of the lantern he had lit. He turned and left, pulling the heavy barn door closed behind him, the sound of the wooden bar falling into place echoing with finality. Cora was alone. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft, her movements stiff and slow. She sank down into the sweet-smelling hay, the exhaustion of the day washing over her in a great, numbing wave. Through a crack in the roof, she could see the sky, a dark, starless expanse. The snow was falling thicker now, silent and relentless, blanketing the world in white, erasing all the tracks, all the paths, all the signs of life. She felt as though she, too, was being erased. She unwrapped the food, but she could not eat. A knot of grief and fear was lodged in her throat. The wedding she had hoped for, her one chance at a respectable life, was gone. The family she had hoped to join had cast her aside like trash. The reputation she had so carefully guarded was in tatters. She was nothing, a piece of whispered gossip, a ruined bride in a muddy dress, hiding in a stranger's barn. She pulled the rough wool blanket tighter around her, but it could not warm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Tears she had refused to shed in front of the prying eyes of the town now fell freely, soaking into the hay. She lay there, watching the snow fall, and prayed. It was not a prayer for rescue, or for vengeance, or even for forgiveness. It was a simple, desperate plea, sent out into the vast, silent, uncaring night. "Please," she whispered to a God she was no longer sure was listening. "Please do not let my life end like this. Forgotten, unloved, alone." Cora awoke to a cold so profound it felt like a solid thing, pressing down on her. The hay had offered some insulation, but the chill had crept into her bones overnight. For a disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. Then the memories of the previous day crashed down on her. The broken coach, the staring faces, the ruined dress, the shame. She was in a stranger's barn, a fugitive from a life that had never truly been hers. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft rustling of the animals below and the gentle whisper of snow falling on the roof. The world felt muffled, buried. She sat up, pulling the rough blanket around her shoulders. Her body ached with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. She looked down at the wedding dress, in the pale morning light filtering through the cracks in the walls. It looked even more pathetic, a ghostly shroud of a future that had died before it could be born. She had to get out of it. It felt like wearing her own coffin. The heavy barn door groaned open, and Eli Morgan stood there, a dark silhouette against the blinding white of the snow-covered world. He carried a tin plate of food and a steaming mug. He did not look up at the loft, but placed the offerings on a clean barrel-head just inside the door. "There's coffee," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "And oatmeal. Eat it before it gets cold." He turned to leave, but hesitated. He looked back, not at her, but at the barn in general. "That dress is not fit for this weather, or this work." He paused, and for a moment Cora thought he would say no more. Then he continued, his words clipped and detached, as if discussing the price of feed. "My wife, my late wife, she left some things behind, in a chest in the cabin. They will be of no more use to her. You are welcome to them." Without waiting for a reply, he walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Cora remained in the loft, his words hanging in the frigid air. The offer was a practical one, a necessary one, but it was also a transgression. To wear a dead woman's clothes felt like a violation, an intrusion into a private sorrow that was not her own. She felt a sharp pang of something that felt like guilt, though she had done nothing wrong. She was a ghost in this man's life, and now he was asking her to wear the clothes of the ghost that truly haunted him. After a long while, Driven by the gnawing cold and the simple need for survival, she climbed down the ladder. The oatmeal was still warm, and she ate it quickly, the heat spreading through her chest. The coffee was black and bitter, but it jolted her awake, clearing some of the fog from her mind. After she had finished, she took a deep breath and walked the short distance from the barn to the cabin. The snow was already several inches deep, and the world was a clean, silent expanse of white. She pushed open the cabin door and stepped inside. The room was small and spare, but a fire in the hearth gave it a sense of warmth and life. In the corner, as he had said, was a dark cedar chest. It was not ornate, but it was well made, its surface smooth and polished from years of care. It seemed to hum with a presence, a repository of a life lived and lost within these four walls. Her hands trembled as she knelt and lifted the heavy lid. A faint scent of dried lavender and old memories rose to meet her. The clothes inside were neatly folded, a testament to an orderly and loving hand. There were simple wool skirts, blouses of sturdy calico, a heavy winter cloak lined with flannel, and thick woolen stockings. They were the clothes of a practical woman, a woman who knew the demands of a life on the frontier. Beneath them, she found a pair of worn leather boots, small and sturdy. Cora lifted a dark blue wool skirt, the fabric soft and heavy in her hands. She touched it with a reverence that bordered on fear. These were not just garments, they were relics. They held the shape of another woman's body, the echo of her movements, the scent of her skin. To wear them felt like an act of profound intimacy with a ghost. She felt a wave of dizziness, an overwhelming sense of her own displacement. She was an imposter in this cabin, an imposter in these clothes, an imposter in this life. But the cold was a merciless reality, and the muddy silk of her wedding gown was a prison. With a silent apology to the woman whose name she did not know, she began to change. When Eli returned to the cabin at midday, he found her by the fire, dressed in Sarah's clothes. The blue skirt and gray blouse fit her as if they had been made for her. Her hair was brushed and tied back with a simple ribbon. She was mending a tear in the sleeve of the blouse with a needle and thread she had found in a small sewing box on the mantel. The sight of her stopped him in his tracks. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, it was as if Sarah were sitting there, her head bent over her work in that familiar way. The illusion shattered as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind an ache so sharp it stole his breath. He saw not Sarah, but a stranger wearing her clothes, a stranger who had brought the noisy, complicated world into his sanctuary of silence. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Cora looked up, her hands stilling. She saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, the way his body went rigid. "I hope you do not mind," she said softly. "They are very warm." Eli gave a curt nod, his face an unreadable mask. "They are just clothes," he said, his voice flat. He turned away and began preparing a simple meal of bacon and beans, the clatter of the iron skillet filling the tense silence. They ate without speaking, the unspoken boundary between them now clearly defined, a line drawn by the ghost of the woman whose clothes Cora now wore. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. The snow kept falling, sealing them off from the outside world. It became clear that Cora was not leaving any time soon. She was a woman who had been raised to be ornamental, to be a wife and a mother. But she was not helpless. She began to work, at first tentatively, and then with a growing confidence. She was not a burden, and she was determined not to be treated as one. She started inside, cleaning the small cabin with a thoroughness that it had not seen in 5 years. She swept the floors, washed the single window until it gleamed, and scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth. Eli watched her, saying nothing, his expression guarded. He was a man accustomed to his own Spartan order, and her presence was a disruption. But he could not deny that the cabin felt warmer, brighter, more like a home than it had since Sarah's death. Soon, she followed him outside, Wrapping herself in the heavy cloak she had found in the chest, she learned to chop wood, her movements at first awkward and clumsy, but gradually becoming more fluid and efficient. She helped him feed the livestock, her initial fear of the large animals giving way to a gentle affection. She learned the names he had given them: Blue, the gelding; Daisy, the milk cow; Peter and Paul, the two draft horses. They worked side by side for hours, often without exchanging a single word. The silence between them was a constant presence, a shared space built of his grief and her shame. Yet, in that silence, they began to learn each other. He saw the fierce pride that would not allow her to accept charity, the quiet determination in the set of her jaw as she struggled with a task until she mastered it. She saw the deep well of sadness in his eyes, but also the fundamental decency that had led him to help her. She noticed the way he was gentle with his animals, the calloused hands that could soothe a nervous horse or reset a fence post with equal skill. They were two solitary people, trapped together by a storm, each nursing their own private wounds. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, Cora finally broke the long silence. "You must wonder about me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli did not look at her. He stared into the flames, his hands resting on his knees. "It is not my business." "But you heard the talk in town," she persisted. "You heard what they said." He remained silent, offering her nothing. "They make it sound so sordid," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "So wicked." She took a shaky breath. "I was raised to be a good daughter, a good wife. My mother taught me that a woman's virtue was her only currency. Without it, she was worthless." She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the wool skirt. "We were not a wealthy family. A good marriage was my only prospect, my only escape." She paused, gathering her courage. "There was a harvest dance. 3 years ago, I was 17, a soldier. His name was Thomas. He was handsome, and he said things to me that no one ever had. He made me feel seen." Her cheeks flushed with a faint pink. "We danced, and later, he walked me home by the creek, and he kissed me." She finally looked at Eli. His expression had not changed. "That was all it was, a single kiss, but someone saw us. And in a town like the one I grew from, a kiss is as good as a confession." The whispers started the next day. Thomas was gone. His regiment had moved on. I was left to face the consequences. I was branded, ruined. She gave a short, humorless laugh. "My family sent me to live with an aunt in another territory, hoping the scandal would be forgotten. That is where Mr. Finch's son, Jedediah, met me. He knew nothing of my past. I thought I had a second chance, to be a wife, to be respectable." Her voice broke. "But a secret like that never stays buried. It has a way of following you." She fell silent. The story told, she had laid her shame bare, offering it to him in the quiet intimacy of the fire-lit cabin. Eli was quiet for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the burning logs. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly. "I used to be a lawman." The words were unexpected, and Cora looked at him in surprise. "A long time ago, in a different life." He still would not look at her, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "It is a life that takes things from you. A man I was chasing, he surrendered, but I did not see it, or I did not want to see it." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but Cora could feel the immense weight behind the words. "My past cost me everything, my wife, my child." He said no more. He had offered her a piece of his own brokenness, a confession far darker and heavier than her stolen kiss. He had taken the small, tarnished coin of her shame and matched it with a stone that could drown a man. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with the ghosts of their shared confessions. The next afternoon, they found that one of the mares had given birth during the night. The foal was small and unsteady on its long, spindly legs. It had a deep scrape on its flank, likely from a protruding nail in the stall. "It will need to be cleaned," Eli said, his voice softer than Cora had ever heard it. He went to fetch a bucket of warm water and some clean rags. Cora knelt in the hay beside the foal, murmuring to it in a low, soothing voice. The mare watched her with large, intelligent eyes, but seemed to sense that Cora meant no harm. When Eli returned, he knelt beside her. The two of them enclosed in the small space of the stall. He showed her how to gently wash the wound, his large, rough hands surprisingly tender. "Hold him steady now," he said, as she placed her hand on the foal's back to keep it still. His hand covered hers to guide it. His skin was calloused and warm, and a jolt went through her at the contact. It was the first time they had touched. Their hands brushed as he took the rag from her, and for a split second longer than necessary, her fingers lingered against his. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, but it was charged with all the unspoken things that had been growing between them in the silence. Eli gently, but deliberately, pulled his hand away. The boundary was back in place, but it had been tested. That evening, the tension in the cabin was a thick, palpable thing. They moved around each other with a new awareness, the memory of that brief touch arcing between them like lightning. After their silent meal, Cora could bear it no longer. "Why are you still alone, Eli?" she asked, her voice clear and direct in the quiet room. He looked up from the fire, his eyes dark and shadowed. He seemed to weary of the question, of the life that had led to it. "I told you, my past." "Your past is not who you are now," she interrupted, a new boldness in her voice. "You are a good man." A bitter smile touched his lips. "You do not know me." "I know what I see," she insisted. "I see a man who works hard, who is kind to his animals, who took in a stranger when no one else would. That is not the man you seem to think you are." His face hardened, the walls going up, high and impenetrable. He looked into the fire, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "Some folks do not deserve a second chance." The words were a raw wound, a confession of a guilt so profound it had become the bedrock of his existence. Cora's heart ached for him, for the lonely, self-imposed prison he had built for himself. All her life, she had been told she was unworthy, that her one small mistake had made her undeserving of love or happiness. And here was this man, this good, quiet man, who believed the same of himself, for reasons she could only guess at. Moved by an impulse she did not fully understand, an overwhelming need to offer some small comfort in the face of such profound sorrow. She rose from her chair and went to him. She knelt before him, taking his face in her hands. He stiffened, but did not pull away. His skin was rough beneath her palms, the faint stubble of his beard scratching her skin. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, he did not look away. She saw the pain, the guilt, the loneliness, and the flicker of some long-buried longing. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was a tentative kiss at first, soft and questioning. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, a man carved from stone. Then, with a low groan that seemed to be torn from the depths of his soul, he kissed her back. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, desperate, a release of 5 years of solitude and a lifetime of regret. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loneliness, of a mutual need for warmth in a cold and unforgiving world. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Eli broke away from her, standing abruptly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He ran a hand through his hair, his back to her. The spell was broken, the walls slamming back into place. "That should not have happened," he said, his voice rough. He looked at her, his eyes full of a renewed torment. "It was just a kiss." Cora rose slowly to her feet, her own heart hammering in her chest. She felt the sting of his words, the swift, brutal dismissal of the moment that had passed between them. She saw the panic in his eyes, the fear of what he had just allowed himself to feel. She understood that his words were a shield, meant to protect himself as much as her. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, accepting the boundary he had so forcefully redrawn. "Yes," she whispered, though her lips still tingled from the touch of his, "just a kiss." He turned away from her again, staring into the fire as if it held the answers to a question he was too afraid to ask. Cora retreated to the small cot that had been set up for her in the corner of the room, her body trembling. She lay down, pulling the blankets up to her chin, but she knew she would not sleep. The moment burned inside of her, a hot, bright coal in the cold darkness of the cabin. It burned inside of him, too. She could feel it across the room. It was just a kiss, he had said, but they both knew it was a lie. It was a spark in a tinder-dry forest, and the whole world was about to catch fire. The dawn that followed the kiss arrived gray and reluctant, seeping into the cabin like a cold mist. The world outside was muted, buried under a fresh blanket of snow, and the silence within the cabin was of a new and terrible quality. It was not the comfortable, shared silence of two solitary people. It was a brittle, fragile thing, stretched taut between them, vibrating with the memory of the night before. Every small sound was magnified. The hiss of the fire, the creak of a floorboard, the scrape of a fork against a plate, each one a gunshot in the stillness. Eli had risen before the first light, moving with a ghost's quietness. When Cora awoke, the fire was already built. A pot of coffee was warming on the hearth. But the man himself was gone. She knew he was avoiding her. The kiss, which had felt so necessary, so inevitable in the warm glow of the firelight, now seemed a reckless and foolish thing in the stark light of morning. His words echoed in her mind. It was just a kiss, a dismissal, a wall thrown up between them. She busied herself with chores, moving with a frantic, focused energy that was a lie. She kneaded dough for bread, her knuckles white, pretending her thoughts were on the texture of the flour and not on the rough, calloused feel of his hand in her hair. She swept the floor, her movements short and angry, as if she could brush away the tingling memory of his lips on hers. She was pretending, too, pretending she was not deeply, irrevocably affected, pretending her heart did not clench with a painful mixture of hope and humiliation every time she heard a sound outside the door. Eli spent the day in the far pastures, checking fence lines that did not need checking, his body driven by a need to put as much physical distance between them as possible. The kiss had been a crack in the dam of his grief, and a torrent of feeling he had spent 5 years suppressing had rushed through. He had felt a flicker of life, of warmth, of a future that did not involve the slow, cold march toward the grave, and it terrified him. To feel such a thing was a betrayal of Sarah, of the penance he had sworn to pay for the rest of his days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his wife's face, not as she was in life, smiling, vibrant, but as she was in his guilt-ridden memory, her eyes full of a quiet fear of the man he had become. He worked until his muscles screamed and the sweat froze on his brow, seeking a physical pain that could drown out the emotional turmoil within. When he finally returned to the cabin as dusk fell, the tension was a third presence in the room. He did not meet her eyes. He took off his snow-caked boots by the door and spoke to the floor. "More snow is coming. A blizzard. Maybe. I made stew," she replied to the wall, her voice tight. They ate in that strained silence, the space between them a chasm. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of what had been and what could never be. Each was trapped in their own pretense, and the loneliness that had once been a shared comfort was now an isolating poison. The jarring sound of sleigh bells cut through the evening's quiet. It was a sound so alien to their isolated world that both of them froze, their heads snapping up. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that rested above the mantel. He went to the window, peering cautiously through a small gap in the curtains. A horse-drawn sleigh, dark against the endless white, was making its way up the path to the cabin. "Who is it?" Cora whispered, her heart beginning to pound. "Trouble," Eli said, his voice grim. He turned from the window, his face set like stone. "It's the preacher, and Martha Finch is with him." A cold dread washed over Cora. The town, the world they had been sealed away from, had found them. She felt a primal urge to run, to hide in the barn, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. She stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides as a sharp, insistent knock rattled the cabin door. Eli opened it. Preacher Gable stood on the threshold, his thin frame wrapped in a black wool coat, his face pinched with a righteous piety that was more menacing than any scowl. Beside him stood Martha Finch, her expression a careful mask of smug concern, and her constant companion, the preacher's wife, a small, silent woman whose eyes missed nothing. The cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of their judgment. "Mr. Morgan," the preacher began, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. He peered past Eli into the cabin, his gaze landing on Cora with an unnerving intensity. "We have come out of a deep and Christian concern, for you and for the spiritual welfare of this young woman." Eli did not move. He blocked the doorway with his body, a silent, unbreachable wall. "She is not your concern, preacher." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken," Martha Finch interjected, her voice sharp. "The girl's reputation is a stain upon this community. We had thought she had the good sense to move on, but rumors reached us. Rumors that you were harboring her here, unmarried, unchaperoned. It is an affront to all decent, God-fearing folk." Cora felt her face flush with a hot, shameful fire. She was being discussed as if she were a stray animal, a piece of property that had been misplaced. She wanted to be invisible, to shrink into the very floorboards. "What we do on this land is our own business," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sin is everyone's business." "Mr. Morgan," Preacher Gable said, stepping forward, forcing Eli to take a step back into the cabin. The three of them followed him in, their wet boots soiling the clean floor. They brought the chill of the grave with them. "We have come to offer Miss Whitley a chance at redemption. She must return to town with us. Immediately. We will find a place for her to do penance, to work in service to the church until she has demonstrated true remorse for her fallen state. If she refuses, we will have no choice but to formally denounce her from the pulpit. She will be labeled an immoral woman, and no decent person in this territory will associate with her." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was a life sentence. To be cast out so formally was to be rendered a pariah, unable to find work, to buy goods, to find a room to rent. It was a slow, public starvation of the body and the soul. Cora stood frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. She looked at their faces, the preacher's cold certainty, Mrs. Finch's cruel satisfaction, Mrs. Gable's silent, avid curiosity. They were the arbiters of her fate, the judges of a crime she had never committed. All her life, she had been taught to bow to such authority, to accept the judgment of her betters. She opened her mouth to speak, to acquiesce, to beg for mercy, but no words came out. Then Eli moved. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his rifle. He simply spoke, and his words, delivered in a low, even tone, were more shocking than any shout. "She is not going anywhere." The preacher blinked, taken aback. "Mr. Morgan, you are inviting scandal upon your own head. You are interfering with the moral governance of this community." Eli's eyes, which had been so full of conflict and sorrow, were now clear and hard as blue ice. He looked at the three of them, his gaze moving from one to the next. And, for the first time, Cora saw the lawman he used to be, the man who had faced down dangers she could not imagine. "You talk about her soul," he said, his voice cutting through their pious certainty. "But you do not care about her. You care about your rules, your reputations. You left her on a bench to freeze. You would see her scrub floors on her knees for the rest of her life to satisfy your own sense of righteousness." He took a step closer, and Preacher Gable instinctively flinched. "You want to know what I think? I think she's safer out here, in this cabin, than she would ever be anywhere near your kind." A collective gasp went through the small delegation. Martha Finch's face turned a mottled shade of red, her mask of concern dropping to reveal the raw fury beneath. The preacher was, for once, speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Eli walked to the door and opened it wide, letting the frigid wind swirl into the room. "Now get off my land." It was not a request. It was an order, delivered with an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. They stared at him for a beat longer, their shock warring with their indignation. Then, defeated by the sheer force of his will, they turned. They shuffled out of the cabin, their mission a failure, their dignity in tatters. Eli watched them climb back into their sleigh, and only when the sound of the bells had faded into the snowy distance did he close the door, plunging the room back into silence. The silence that followed was different yet again. The tension of the morning was gone, replaced by the humming aftermath of the confrontation. Cora stared at him, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. He had defended her. He had stood between her and the judgment of the world, taking her shame and making it his own. No one had ever done that for her before. Eli did not look at her. He went to the fire and stared into the flames. His shoulders slumped, as if the effort had cost him everything he had. After a long time, he spoke, his voice heavy with a familiar weariness. "I am sorry," he said.
"Sorry?"
she whispered, confused.
"You saved me."
"I made it worse," he said, finally turning to face her. The hardness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, aching guilt. "They will not let this go. The talk will be worse than ever now. For both of us. I have tied my reputation to yours, and in their eyes, that has damned us both." He ran a hand over his face. "If you want to leave, I understand. I will not blame you. I will ride with you in the morning, take you to another town, give you what money I have. You could start over, where no one knows you." He was offering her an escape. He was offering to erase what had just happened, to erase the kiss, to erase the fragile, unspoken thing that had grown between them in this snowbound cabin. He was trying to do the proper thing, the honorable thing. But Cora knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very core, that it was the last thing on earth she wanted. Leaving would not be a new start. It would be a return to the loneliness, a return to being a ghost. She looked at this man, this solitary, wounded man who had just declared war on the world for her sake, and who was now trying to retreat from the battlefield. She saw his guilt, his fear, his desperate attempt to keep the walls around his heart intact, and she knew she could not let him. She did not answer him with words. She walked to where she had hung her shawl to dry by the fire and took it from the peg. Then she let it fall from her fingers to the floor. The gesture was simple, but it was a surrender and a declaration all at once. Slowly, her fingers went to the buttons on the front of her woolen skirt. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm. She undid the first button, then the second. The heavy fabric gaped open, revealing the simple petticoat beneath. Eli watched her, his breath catching in his throat. He stood as still as a statue, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and a raw, undeniable yearning. She took a step toward him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, but it filled the entire cabin.
"I do not want to leave,"
she said, her gaze locked with his. "I want you to stop pretending. She was not just talking about his offer to take her away. She was talking about the kiss. She was talking about the charged silence, the stolen glances, the unbearable tension of the last 24 hours. She was asking him to stop pretending that he felt nothing, to stop hiding behind the ghost of his wife and the weight of his guilt. Eli trembled, a violent shudder that ran through his entire body. He was torn between two worlds. One was the cold, safe world of his penance, of his loyalty to a memory. The other was the world that stood before him, warm and breathing and real, offering a solace he had long ago decided he did not deserve. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing on his chest, screaming at him to turn away, to send her away, to restore the sanctity of his sorrow. But the yearning was a fire in his blood, a deep, primal need for another human soul, for the warmth he had been so long without. She took another step, until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached out and took his calloused, trembling hand in hers. Her touch was an anchor in the storm of his emotions. Then, with her other hand, she reached past him and slid the heavy wooden bar across the cabin door, shutting it with a soft, final thud. The sound was an answer. It shut out the world. It shut out the preacher, the gossips, the snow, the past. It left only the two of them, the fire and the choice. When she closed the door, he let the world fall away. With a sound that was half groan, half prayer, he pulled her to him. His kiss was not like the one before. It was not a hesitant exploration, but a desperate, claiming act. It was the kiss of a drowning man finding air. She met his desperation with her own, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding on as if she, too, were drowning. Their union was a collision, an intense, tender, and desperate confluence of long-held grief and hidden longing. It was a shedding of old skins, a release of sorrows too heavy to carry alone. In the flickering firelight, they found not just passion, but a raw, aching sanctuary in each other's arms, a temporary truce in the war against their own loneliness. Afterward, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, they lay under a pile of blankets. The silence between them no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a profound, exhausted peace. Eli said nothing. He could not find the words to name what had just happened. He gently pulled a blanket over her bare shoulder, his touch lingering for a moment on her skin. Then he rose and sat in the chair by the hearth, a dark, solitary figure in the dying light. He did not sleep. He watched the fire, and he watched over her, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window. In the aftermath, they did not speak of what they were. The words did not exist, or perhaps they were too dangerous to summon. Instead, they fell into a new kind of silence, a quiet domesticity that settled over the small cabin like a fresh layer of snow. It was a life measured in small, unspoken gestures. He would rise first, stoking the fire to life, and the smell of coffee would be her alarm. She would have a hot breakfast waiting for him when he came in from tending the animals, and he would eat without comment. But his eyes would hold a flicker of something that looked like gratitude. They were two planets, held in a strange, silent orbit, circling the warm sun of the hearth. Their days were filled with the familiar rhythms of work, of survival. But now, their tasks were often shared. They would saw wood together. The pull and push of the two-man saw a steady, rhythmic conversation between their bodies. They repaired the tack in the evenings by the firelight, their hands moving in comfortable proximity, the smell of leather and linseed oil filling the air. Sometimes, their fingers would brush as they reached for the same tool, a fleeting touch that sent a current arcing through the quiet. They would pull back, neither acknowledging the jolt, but it would linger in the space between them, a silent testament to the intimacy they refused to name. They were not lovers, not in the way the world understood the word. They were something else, something forged in a crucible of shame and sorrow and sealed by a winter storm. They were partners in survival, companions in solitude. They were two people who had found a fragile harbor in each other, and they were terrified of the storm that a single word might unleash. So they said nothing. They lived in the quiet closeness, sharing meals, warmth, and a bed, their bodies finding a language that their voices could not. Cora, no longer a guest, began to inhabit the space. She started to make the cabin her own, not with any grand design, but with a series of small, gentle acts. She found a crate of old glass jars in the root cellar and washed them until they sparkled, lining them up on the shelf where they caught the winter light. She took down the threadbare curtains from the single window, patched their worn spots with a piece of calico from her trunk, and rehung them, the small act brightening the entire room. She was careful, respectful of the ghost that still lived there. She was not erasing Sarah. She was simply making room for herself. One afternoon, while Eli was out checking his trap lines, she undertook the task she had been avoiding, the cedar chest. She opened it again, the scent of lavender and memory rising to meet her. She carefully took out the remaining clothes, airing them out before folding them again, this time with a small sachet of dried pine needles she had made herself. At the very bottom of the chest, she found a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished with age, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She did not open the locket or read the letters. They were not for her. She gently polished the silver with a soft cloth until it shone, tied the ribbon anew, and placed the box on the mantelpiece, next to a small, whittled bird that Eli must have carved. It was an act of honor, a quiet acknowledgement of the woman whose life had been lived within these walls. When Eli returned and saw the box, he stopped, his body going still. He looked at the gleaming locket, then at Cora. His face was a thundercloud of unexpressed emotion. She had touched the most sacred relics of his past, and he felt a surge of something hot and protective, a feeling so closely followed by a wave of guilt that it made him dizzy. He saw Cora, her face open and earnest, standing by the fire she had built, in the home she had made warm, wearing his dead wife's clothes, and he felt as though he were being torn in two. He said nothing. But that night, he lay on his side of the bed, his back to her, a rigid wall of muscle and regret. His guilt was a relentless hunter. It stalked him in the daylight hours and tormented him in his dreams. He would be splitting wood, the axe rising and falling, and he would see Sarah's face in the grain of the pine, her smile sad and questioning. He would walk into the cabin, and for a heart-stopping instant, the woman turning from the stove would be his wife, her form and movements so achingly familiar. Then the vision would resolve itself into Cora, and the guilt would twist in his gut like a knife. He was betraying his wife's memory. He was letting this new warmth, this new life, seep into the cracks of the monument of grief he had so carefully constructed. He grew more distant, his silence becoming heavier, colder. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. He stopped meeting her eyes altogether. Cora felt the shift, the withdrawal. The fragile peace they had built was beginning to crumble. She did not know the shape of the ghosts that haunted him, but she felt their chilling presence in the cabin, in the growing distance between their bodies in the dark. Then the blizzard struck. It did not arrive with a gentle warning. It descended upon them with the fury of an invading army, a great white beast that devoured the world. The sky, which had been a placid gray, turned a churning, violent white. The wind shrieked and clawed at the cabin, rattling the door in its frame and driving snow through the smallest of cracks. The day before the storm hit its peak, Eli had noticed that Daisy's new calf, a clumsy, sweet-faced thing not more than a few weeks old, was missing from the barn. They searched the immediate area, but the wind was already picking up, and the visibility was shrinking with every passing minute. "It is no use," Eli had said, his voice grim as he pulled the barn door shut against the rising gale. "If he wandered too far, he is lost. We cannot risk ourselves for him." But Cora could not accept it. The calf was a small, tangible piece of life, of a future. On this isolated homestead that she had begun to think of as her own. That night, she lay awake, listening to the roar of the wind, her mind filled with the image of the small, frightened animal, alone in the storm, before the sun was fully up, while Eli was still asleep. She bundled herself in the heavy cloak and slipped out of the cabin. She told herself she would only look in the sheltered aspen grove by the creek. It was a foolish, reckless hope, but it was a hope she could not let go of. The world was a maelstrom of white. The snow was a blinding, disorienting curtain, and the wind stole the breath from her lungs. Every landmark was gone, erased. She pushed on, her sense of direction failing her, her body growing numb with a cold that was so intense it felt like fire. She found the calf, huddled and shivering in the lee of a large rock formation, not far from where she had imagined. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her weak. She managed to get the half-frozen animal to its feet and began the agonizingly slow process of herding it back toward the barn. Eli awoke to an empty bed and a cold dread that seized his heart. He saw her footprints leading from the cabin door, already being swallowed by the drifting snow. A string of curses left his lips, raw and furious. A fury born of pure terror. He pulled on his gear and plunged into the storm after her. He found her not 100 yards from the barn, struggling to drag the calf through a deep drift. She was covered in snow, her face pale and her lips blue. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and shame.
I found him,
she gasped, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. He did not speak. He hauled the calf the rest of the way to the barn, his movements rough and angry. He settled the animal with its mother and then turned to Cora. He pulled her into the relative quiet of the tack room, his hands gripping her arms.
That was the act of a damn fool,
he snarled, his voice shaking with a terror he could not conceal.
You could have died out there. For nothing.
Tears of cold and fear froze on her cheeks.
I could not just leave him.
He looked at her, at the fierce, stubborn loyalty in her eyes, and his anger dissolved, leaving behind only the raw, terrifying fear. He pulled her into the cabin and stripped off her frozen cloak and wet clothes, his movements urgent and impersonal. He wrapped her in every blanket they owned and sat her by the fire, forcing hot coffee into her trembling hands. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. The chill had settled deep in her lungs, and a harsh, rasping cough shook her small frame. She became delirious, her mind adrift in a fever dream. Eli did not leave her side. He sat through the long, dark night, the storm raging outside a mirror of the tempest in his own soul. He bathed her face with cool water, held the cup to her cracked lips, and listened to her muttered, incoherent words. All the helplessness he had felt 5 years ago came rushing back. He was in this room again, with a woman he cared for. Watching her fight a battle he was powerless to help her win. The ghosts he had been wrestling with were no longer just memories. They were present, tangible things, filling the small cabin with their icy breath. He saw Sarah's face, pale and sweating in the lamplight. And then it would morph into Cora's, her cheeks flushed with fever, the two images blurred, the past and the present colliding in his terrified mind. He leaned over her, his heart a raw, aching wound. He took her small, hot hand in his own, clinging to it as if it were a lifeline. You cannot, he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he had long since buried. I cannot lose someone again. Do you hear me? I cannot. It was a confession, a plea, torn from the deepest, most guarded part of his soul. He was no longer fighting the feeling. He was fighting for her. In a moment of fevered clarity, her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy and unfocused, but they seemed to look right through him. She began to speak, her voice a reedy, broken whisper, the words tumbling out as if from a great distance. Always, always unwanted, she murmured, her gaze fixed on the ceiling.
Sent away. A whisper. A scandal.
He was supposed to, Jedediah was supposed to save me, but he did not want me either. No one ever does. No one ever chooses the ruined girl, not proudly. Her voice cracked, and a single tear traced a path from the corner of her eye into her hairline. I will never be someone a man chooses proudly. Her words struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. He heard in them the echo of his own actions. He had taken her in. He had defended her. He had shared his bed with her, but he had never chosen her, not in the way she meant. He had kept her a secret, a companion for his solitude, wrapped in the silence of their unnamed arrangement. He was no better than the Finches. He had used her warmth to get through the winter, but he had never offered her the shelter of his name, the pride of his public affection. He had let her believe she was a source of shame. He leaned down, his face close to hers. He smoothed the damp hair back from her forehead, his touch infinitely tender. He pressed his lips to her fever-hot skin, a kiss that held no passion, only a deep and aching reverence. "You were never ashamed to me," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Never." She did not seem to hear him. Her eyes closed again, and she drifted back into the delirium. But Eli kept repeating the words to himself, a litany, a vow. He held her hand through the rest of the night, a silent, steadfast guardian against the shadows. The blizzard broke 2 days later. The wind died, and a weak, watery sun emerged, making the new fallen world glitter with a blinding, pristine beauty. Cora's fever broke with the storm. She awoke weak and exhausted, but the fire in her lungs had cooled to embers. She remembered the illness only in fractured, nightmarish images, but she remembered the feeling of his hand holding hers, the constant, reassuring presence of him by her side. A new, fragile peace settled between them, born of the shared ordeal. The walls he had rebuilt were gone, washed away by the flood of his fear. But the world outside their small, snowbound sanctuary had not been idle. When Cora was strong enough to be left alone for a few hours, Eli rode into Redemption for medicine and supplies. The town felt different. The stares that followed him were colder, more openly hostile. The whispers were louder. When he entered the saloon to buy a bottle of laudanum, he saw it. It was a piece of paper, nailed to the rough wooden wall next to the bar, for all to see. It was written in the preacher's neat, unforgiving script. It was a formal notice from the church council. It declared that one Miss Cora Whitley, currently residing in an unhallowed state with the rancher Eli Morgan, was hereby designated a woman of disrepute. It forbade her from attending church services, and it strongly advised all good Christian folk to refrain from offering her employment or engaging in commerce with her. It was a public branding, an excommunication from the world of decent people. Eli stood there, reading the words, and a cold, silent fury built in his chest. The fragile peace he had found in the heart of the storm was shattered. The world had come for her, and he was the one who had led it to her door. Eli did not ride from the saloon. He moved with the grim purpose of a man marching to a battle he knew he could not avoid. The fury that had seized him was not hot and explosive, but a cold, hard thing that settled deep in his belly. He did not go to the church. He went to the small, neat house that stood beside it, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney, a picture of pious tranquility that was a profound lie. He did not knock. His fist hit the door with 3 sharp, heavy blows that echoed in the frozen air. The door was opened by Mrs. Gable, who took one look at the expression on Eli's face and scurried back into the house like a frightened mouse. A moment later, Preacher Gable appeared, holding a book in one hand, his finger marking his place. He composed his face into a mask of solemn concern. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his tone one of mild rebuke. "To what do we owe this vigorous visit?" Eli stepped past him into the house, forcing the preacher to back away. The room was warm and smelled of beeswax and old paper. It was a place of order, of rules written in books, a world away from the raw, elemental life of the ranch. "The notice," Eli said, his voice a low growl.
"In the saloon."
The preacher closed his book, his expression unwavering. "A regrettable but necessary measure. The moral order of our community must be upheld. Your actions have forced our hand."
"My actions?"
Eli's voice was laced with a dangerous disbelief.
"I gave a woman shelter from a storm. Your storm. The one you and the Finches created. And for that, you nail her name to a wall like a wanted poster?"
"She is living in sin under your roof," the preacher stated, his voice gaining strength, his certainty absolute. "That is not shelter. That is an affront to God's law and the laws of this community. The notice is a warning to others, and a call to repentance for her."
"Repentance for what?"
Eli took a step closer, and, despite himself, the preacher's eyes flickered with fear. "For being left at the altar? For having her name dragged through the mud by a rich man's wife? For trying to survive in a world that cast her out? You are a party to her corruption. Mr. Morgan, you defend her sin, and in doing so, you make it your own. The notice stands." Gable's chin lifted, a gesture of defiance. He was on his own ground now, armed with the unassailable armor of his own righteousness. Eli saw the futility of the argument. He was speaking a language the preacher could not, or would not, understand. He was talking about a human being, and the preacher was talking about a principle. He changed his tactic.
"What will it take?"
he asked, his voice suddenly quiet. "To have it taken down?" A flicker of something, triumph, perhaps, passed through the preacher's eyes. He had been waiting for this question. It was the moment of negotiation, the moment his power would be affirmed. "There is one path to redemption for a woman in her state," he said smoothly. "A path that would sanctify the union in the eyes of God and man, and restore her to the community." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. "Marry her, Mr. Morgan. Take her as your wife. Stand before me in the church and make your vows. Do that, and the notice will come down. The judgment will be lifted. She will be Mrs. Morgan, a respectable married woman, and her past will be forgiven." The ultimatum was a perfectly sprung trap. It was not an act of mercy, but an act of control. It would force Eli into a public act of submission, bending his knee to the very community standards he despised. It would legitimize their power and erase his rebellion by absorbing it into the institution of marriage. Eli stared at the preacher, at the man's calm, certain face, and felt a profound, soul-deep weariness. He had come for a fight and had been handed a life sentence. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving the preacher standing victorious in his warm, orderly room. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a frozen hell of his own making. The preacher's words echoed with the rhythmic thud of Blue's hooves on the snow. Marry her. The thought was an impossibility, a sacrilege. Marriage was a word that belonged to Sarah, to the life he had lost, to give it to another woman, especially under these circumstances, felt like the ultimate betrayal. But to refuse was to condemn Cora to the life of a pariah, to leave her name nailed to that wall for all to see. He was trapped between his loyalty to the dead and his responsibility to the living. Cora was waiting for him. She had seen him ride in, had seen the rigid set of his shoulders and the grim line of his mouth. She knew something was terribly wrong. She met him at the door, her face etched with a question she was almost too afraid to ask. "What is it, Eli? What happened in town?" He did not want to tell her. He wanted to shield her from this final, vicious blow. But he looked into her clear, steady eyes and knew he could not lie to her. He owed her the truth, no matter how ugly. "He will not take it down," Eli said, his voice flat as he pulled off his gloves. "The notice. He will not take it down unless—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Unless what?" she pressed, her voice a thin thread of sound. Eli finally met her gaze, his own eyes full of oblique, helpless anger. "Unless I marry you." The words dropped into the quiet of the cabin like stones into a deep well. Cora stared at him, her face draining of all color. She took a half-step back, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. She understood the terrible logic of it instantly. It was not a proposal, it was a ransom. Her reputation, her future, held hostage, and the price was his freedom. She saw the agony in his face, the conflict that was tearing him apart. He was considering it. He was actually considering chaining himself to her, to a woman he had taken in out of pity, all to satisfy the moral blackmail of a small-town preacher. The thought was a humiliation so profound it was like a physical pain. Her fever-dream confession came rushing back to her. I will never be someone a man chooses proudly. This was the ultimate proof of it. A marriage of duty. A rescue. Another man deciding her fate, saving her from a mess he had helped create. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. "No," she whispered. The word choked with a rising panic. She shook her head, her whole body trembling. "No, you will not." "Cora, it is the only way," he began, taking a step toward her. "The only way for what?" she cried, her voice cracking. "To make me respectable, to turn me into an honest woman? I will not be your penance, Eli. I will not be a chore you have to perform to clear your conscience." She backed away from him, her hands held up as if to ward him off. The tears were streaming down her face now. "All my life, I have been a problem to be solved, a scandal to be managed, sent away by my family, cast aside by the Finches. I will not let you do this. I will not be your burden." She looked at him, her eyes pleading, desperate. "I want to be chosen, not rescued." Her words hit him harder than the preacher's ultimatum. He saw the raw, desperate need in her, the lifelong yearning to be wanted for herself, not for what she represented or what could be done to fix her. And he saw how his silence, his guilt, his inability to name what was between them, had made him just another man who was failing her. She was right. He had to stop trying to rescue her and start telling her the truth. All of it. "You are not my burden," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer suppress. "You are the first thing that has made sense in 5 years. And that is what scares me." He walked to the window and looked out at the vast, empty expanse of snow. He had to show her the darkness inside him. He had to give her a real choice, based on the real man, not the silent protector she thought he was. "You asked me about my past," he said, his back still to her. "I told you I was a lawman. I did not tell you why I stopped." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "The war, it changes a man. It boils things down to kill or be killed. You live that way for years, and it gets into your blood. It is a poison that you carry with you. When I came back, I tried to be a husband, a lawman. I tried to put that part of me away, but it was always there, sleeping just under the surface." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with the memory. "We were tracking a gang of outlaws. We cornered the last one in a box canyon. He was young, not much more than a boy. The sun was in my eyes, and the air was full of dust. He threw down his gun. He put his hands up. He surrendered." Eli's voice dropped to a near whisper. But his hand twitched, just a little. Maybe he was reaching up to wipe the sweat from his face. I do not know, but the poison in me, it did not wait to ask. It just reacted. I shot him, an unarmed man with his hands in the air. Cora gasped, her hand still at her mouth. "They called it a lawful shooting," he continued, his voice hollow. "No witnesses saw what I saw. No one questioned the word of a war hero, but I knew, and Sarah, my wife, she knew. She did not say anything. She did not have to. I saw it in her eyes. After that day, she started to look at me differently, with a little bit of fear. She would flinch if I moved too quickly. She stopped arguing with me. She just became quiet, careful." He looked at Cora, his soul laid bare in his gaze. "I did not just lose her in childbirth. Cora, I lost her months before that.
She died afraid of her own husband. That is the guilt I carry. That is the man I am. A man who frightens the woman he loves. A man who carries a violence inside him that he cannot control. He let the terrible confession hang in the air between them. So, when you say you want to be chosen, you need to know what you are choosing. I am not a good man. I am a man with a stain on his soul that will never wash out. He made her a final, desperate offer. I will leave. I will pack my things and ride out of here. The ranch will be yours. The gossip will die down eventually. You can build a life here, free of me, free of the stain of my past. You can have a future. He had offered her everything. His home, her freedom, a clean slate. He was trying to rescue her one last time by removing himself from her life. Cora stood there, listening to the story, to the raw pain and self-loathing in his voice. The tears on her face were no longer for herself, but for him, for the good man who had convinced himself he was a monster. He had shown her the very worst of himself, and in that terrible vulnerability, she saw him more clearly than ever before. She saw the man who was gentle with his animals, the man who had sat by her bed all night when she was sick, the man who had faced down the entire town to protect her. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, until she was standing before him again. She reached up and gently wiped a tear from her own cheek. "I dropped my skirt and I closed that door," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "Because I trusted you. Not because I needed saving." She looked up into his tormented eyes. "I'm not afraid of you, Eli. I have never been afraid of you. I see the man you are, not the man you think you are. And I am not leaving, and neither are you." His control finally broke. A strangled sob escaped his throat, a sound of such profound, wrenching grief that it seemed to tear him apart. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling around him. She held him back, her small frame a bastion against his lifetime of pain. That night, they came together again, but it was not like the first time. There was no desperation, no frantic collision of lonely souls. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a quiet confirmation of a choice that had just been made. It was a conversation without words, an acceptance of the broken pieces, a shared decision to love despite the shame, despite the guilt, despite the ghosts. It was a promise made in the deep, silent darkness of the cabin, a vow to face the world together. Cora awoke the next morning to the smell of a dying fire and a profound stillness. The place beside her in the bed was empty, and it was cold. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She sat up, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "Eli," she called out, her voice small in the quiet room. There was no answer. She got out of bed and saw it immediately. His rifle was gone from the mantel. His saddlebags were gone from the peg by the door. His heavy winter coat was missing. A piece of paper was propped against the coffee pot on the hearth. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was rough, but the words were clear. "I will come back when the world cannot take you from me." The silence Eli left behind was a different creature from the one they had shared. That had been a silence of caution, of unspoken things. This new silence was a hollow, echoing thing, a vast emptiness in the shape of a man. Cora stood in the middle of the cabin, the piece of paper trembling in her hand, and read the words again. "I will come back when the world cannot take you from me." It was not a goodbye. It was a promise. But it was a promise with no date, no certainty. A promise suspended in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of time and distance. The first wave of emotion that washed over her was a cold, sharp grief. He was gone. The warmth, the solid, reassuring presence that had become the center of her small world, had vanished. She walked to the bed and pressed her hand against the indentation his body had left in the straw mattress. It was already cold. A desperate, helpless anger followed. How could he leave? After everything, after she had laid her trust at his feet, after they had finally found a truth together in the darkness, He had simply ridden away. He was still trying to rescue her, still trying to solve the problem of her by removing himself. He did not trust her strength. He did not trust their strength. She walked to the door and looked out. His tracks were already beginning to soften in the morning sun, a fading line heading away from her, away from the home they had started to build. She could have collapsed. She could have given in to the crushing weight of the loneliness, packed her few belongings, and walked away from the ranch, away from the gossip, away from the memory of him. The world would have understood. It would have expected it. But as she stood there, the cold air on her face, looking at the words he had written, a third, quieter feeling began to rise within her, a stubborn, defiant resolve. He had left her his home. He had entrusted her with this piece of land, with his animals, with the silent heart of his life. And he had made a promise. He was out there, somewhere, fighting the world for her. She would not let him come back to find she had surrendered. She would not be the helpless woman waiting to be rescued. She would wait. Yes, but she would not be idle. She would build a fortress for his return. And so, Cora Morgan, for in her heart she had taken his name that last night, stayed. The first few weeks were a lesson in the true meaning of solitude. The silence of the cabin was a physical presence that she had to learn to live with. At night, the bed felt impossibly large and empty. During the day, the small, familiar sounds of the homestead, the lowing of the cow, the nicker of the horses, the cry of a distant hawk, were her only companions. She talked to them, her voice at first strange and rusty in the quiet. But soon it became a comfort, a way to fill the echoing space he had left behind. The world did not forget her. A week after Eli left, one of the neighboring ranchers, a gruff old man named Silas, rode over, his face a mixture of curiosity and pity. He had heard the news from town, of course. The notice was still up. He offered to buy Eli's horses, assuming the man had run off for good and left the woman destitute. Cora met him on the porch, her back straight, her hands clean but her fingernails lined with dirt from the garden she had started to till. "The horses are not for sale," she said, her voice even and calm. "And neither is the ranch. My husband will be returning." The word hung in the air between them. Husband? She had claimed it, a shield and a declaration. Silas looked at her, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes, and saw not a fallen woman, but the mistress of a homestead. He tipped his hat, mumbled an apology, and rode away. The rumor he spread was a new one. The woman on the Morgan ranch was not a victim. She was waiting. She learned by doing. She learned the heft of the axe, the protest of her muscles as she chopped the last of the winter firewood. She learned to mend a broken fence rail. Her hands clumsy at first, but growing more confident with each nail, she hammered straight. She learned to hunt, taking Eli's smaller rifle into the woods, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration as she brought down a rabbit for her stew pot. She was often tired, her body aching with a weariness she had never known, but it was a good, clean ache. It was the ache of self-sufficiency. She worked the small patch of land behind the cabin, turning over the cold, hard soil as the last of the snows melted away. She found a small bag of seeds in the root cellar, beans, squash, and corn. She planted them in neat, straight rows, her hands moving through the rich, dark earth. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future harvest, a belief in a season of abundance to come. She was not just surviving, she was planting roots. To avoid the hostile stares of redemption, she made the long, 2-day ride to a trading post further south. She loaded the buckboard with the extra pelts she had found that Eli had trapped, a few jars of the preserves she had made from the last of the winter apples, and 24 eggs from the hen she had started to tend. The trader, a man who cared more for the quality of her goods than the state of her reputation, gave her a fair price. She returned with flour, salt, sugar, and a small, precious bag of coffee beans. The journey was long and lonely, but the feeling of riding back to the ranch, her wagon filled with supplies she had earned with her own 2 hands, was a triumph. She was no longer dependent on anyone. She was building her own independence, one small victory at a time. Spring arrived, not as a gentle guest, but as a riotous, joyful explosion of life. The creeks swelled with melted snow, their roar replacing the winter's silence. The aspens sprouted tiny, trembling green leaves. The valley floor, so long buried under white, was now a carpet of new grass and wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and sunny dandelions. The world was being reborn, and Cora felt a mirroring rebirth within herself. The sharp edges of her loneliness had softened. The grief of his absence was still there, a constant, low ache in her heart, but it was now intertwined with a sense of purpose and a quiet, steady hope. She was stronger than she'd ever been. She knew who she was, not as a daughter, not as a ruined bride, but as a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet on her own piece of land. One bright afternoon in late May, a mail rider, a young boy on a fast pony, made a rare detour to the ranch. He carried a single, sweat-stained letter, addressed not to her, but to Mr. Eli Morgan. He handed it to her with a shy, curious glance and was gone in a cloud of dust before she could say a word. Her hands trembled as she looked at the envelope. It was from a law office in Cheyenne. She knew she should not open it. It was his mail. But a powerful, undeniable instinct told her that this letter was the reason he had left, the key to the promise he had made, with a prayer for forgiveness. She slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. The legal language was dense and difficult, but the meaning was clear. A man, a former soldier named Corporal John Abernathy, had come forward with a deathbed confession. He had been part of Eli's company during the war and had been present at the shooting in the Box Canyon. He confessed that the boy they had cornered had not been reaching up to wipe away sweat. He had been reaching for a second, smaller pistol hidden in his boot. It had been a trick, a last desperate act of a cornered man. Eli's shot had not been an execution. It had been a reaction. It had been lawful. It had been self-defense. Cora sank down onto the porch steps, the letter clutched in her hand. A great, shuddering sob of relief escaped her. The ghost that had haunted him for so long was finally exorcised. The stain on his soul, the one he believed could never be washed away, was gone. The world could no longer hold his past against him. And if it could no longer hold his past against him, it could no longer use that past to take her from him. He was free. He came that evening. The sun was setting, painting the western ridges in strokes of orange and purple. She was on the porch, the letter in her lap, watching the light fade, her heart a wild symphony of hope and anxiety. She saw him first as a distant speck on the trail, a lone rider moving steadily toward her. She did not run to him. She stood and waited, her hands clasped in front of her, her entire being focused on the approaching figure. He rode into the yard and swung down from his horse. He was dust-covered from head to toe, his face leaner than she remembered, etched with new lines of exhaustion. He looked as though he had ridden to the end of the world and back, but his eyes were different. The deep, haunted sorrow was gone. In its place was a quiet, weary joy, a peace. He stopped a few feet away from her, his horse's reins held loosely in his hand. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his gaze taking in everything, the healthy blush on her cheeks, the new confidence in her posture, the calluses on her hands. He looked at the cabin behind her, at the neat rows of green shoots in the garden, at the tidy woodpile, at the home she had kept for him. Cora did not speak either. The silence stretched between them. But it was not the silence of fear or shame. It was the silence of a long-awaited homecoming, a silence so full of emotion there was no room for words. She saw the question in his eyes, the hope, the uncertainty. He was waiting for her to speak, to pass judgment, to welcome him or turn him away. She gave him her answer, slowly. She reached up and pulled off her sturdy work gloves, finger by finger. She let them drop to the porch floor. Then she stepped down from the porch, walked the few feet that separated them, and stood before him. She raised herself onto her toes, put her hands on his shoulders, and kissed him on the mouth. It was not a plea. It was not a question. It was a statement. It was a kiss of welcome, of ownership, of a love that had been tested by distance and silence and had not only survived, but had grown stronger. He responded instantly, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her tight against him, his kiss answering hers with all the pent-up longing of the lonely weeks. When they finally broke apart, she took his hand and led him toward the cabin. In the doorway, she stopped. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. Then, she turned, reached for the heavy wooden door, and pulled it shut behind them. She was not the desperate girl closing out the world. She was a woman, standing on the threshold of her own home, bringing her partner in from the wilderness. She was not a prize to be claimed. She was an equal, choosing the man she loved. The seasons that followed were a time of rebuilding, not just the ranch, but themselves. They worked side by side, their movements a familiar, comfortable dance. They cut new lumber from the tall pines on the ridge, repairing the old barn roof, their saws and hammers a cheerful, industrious sound in the valley. They expanded the garden, and one afternoon, he brought her a small cloth bag. Inside were wildflower seeds. Together, they walked to the small rise overlooking the creek, to the lone pine tree that marked Sarah's grave, and together they sowed the seeds, a quiet, gentle act of remembrance and of new beginnings. They were not burying the past, but making it a part of the beauty of their future. That autumn, a new storm brewed in the mountains, the clouds dark and heavy with the promise of the first snow. But this time, they did not fear it. They sat before the fire, his arm around her head on his shoulder, and listened to the rising wind. The world outside could rage, but inside their small cabin, they were safe. Through all the tragedy and all the scandal, their love had not only survived, it had prevailed. Not because it was easy or perfect, but because, against all odds, it was chosen. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.